Hey everyone, welcome to my lecture introducing you to the basic concepts of research. So I'm going to approach this lecture in a couple of main parts. The first part is going to be about why we do research and what the purpose of it is. The second is going to be about what good evidence entails. The third is going to be about broad suggestions for how to research or general principles that should guide your thinking about it. And the fourth is going to be more details about how you can use the internet, search engines, and databases to get them to produce exactly the cards that you want. So based on the card diagnostic, it seems that most of you know what a card is generally and what a card is supposed to look like. So I'm going to proceed from that assumption, but if not, we can definitely catch you up, and that's not a problem at all. So first, why do we do research? The first reason that we do research, and we often lose sight of this, but it's for the educational benefits. Research is what makes debate a valuable activity. First is research teaches you a lot of substantive information. The best rounds are great and can teach you a lot, but even the best rounds are going to be short and are inherently going to be capped in how much depth they can capture, just because they're only about 2 hours long. The average round is also not an example of the best kind of rounds that we have. The average debate is not very comparative. The average debate doesn't have very much clash. So if you're relying exclusively on your debates to teach you about the topic, you're not going to learn very much, and you're not going to remember what you do learn. The best way to overcome this is by doing a lot of topic research. It's by internalizing experts' assumptions and by internalizing expert positions. And this is better than taking the likely distorted and cherry-picked views of your opponent's cards for granted. Research allows you to scrutinize all of those foundational assumptions and form your own opinions, which is far more durable than anything you can learn within the brief time span of a shallow debate. The second aspect of research's educational benefits is about the process. Research and the information processing abilities that you learn from it are both marketable and academically useful skills. If you can write a good file, you can write the core of a research paper. You can write a policy or a legal brief. You can write an issue digest. More importantly, you can reach conclusions for yourself on important issues that shape the world. So, by learning to research, you become a more informed citizen, not just through the process of internalizing facts, but through the process of internalizing a mechanism that enables you to process information that comes at you. The second reason we do research, beyond the educational benefits, is about the competitive benefits, of course. There are several aspects to how research helps us benefit competitively. The first dimension is that research helps us substantiate the claims that we make. Arguments are obviously more credible when they're backed up by experts than when we're merely asserting them. This is the main reason why we read cards. When you make an analytic, there can be an internal logic behind it, but it's inherently more persuasive when someone qualified can back you up on your opinion. The second reason why it provides competitive benefits is that research can help judges evaluate and compare arguments. This is both a pre-round and an in-round benefit. It's a pre-round benefit because it enables you to evaluate arguments yourself. It helps you stake out the positions that are in reality the most defensible, which makes it easier for you to win, because usually it's inherently going to be easier for you to have a debate if you're right about a position. It's also helpful in-round. You can make informed evaluations about the relative strength of your positions and your opponent's positions, or you can decide which of your opponent's positions are the most threatening. And of course, there's also a post-round benefit. When you have evidence that draws comparisons between a variety of different arguments, you can rely on that evidence to compare your positions to your opponent's positions. And much like the argument about credibility, those judges that read that evidence are going to be inherently more persuaded by comparisons like that are grounded in qualified sources than by any comparison that you could make off the cuff. An ancillary benefit of research in this area is that it's going to make you sound smarter. This is similar to the educational benefit, but it also has a competitive dimension. By doing research, you internalize not just the facts that the research presents you with, but also a way of thinking and a way of speaking about issues that makes you resemble an expert. Part of how you win is not just by having cards on every issue, it's by developing a sense of built-up credibility with judges, such that when you don't have a card on something because you're caught off guard, you can speak credibly and authoritatively to that issue in a way that will make judges more likely to believe you than your opponent, even when your opponents have cards on those questions. Some of history's best debaters were incredibly proficient at this. Debaters like Hemant or Natalie Knez had expert understandings of the topic that enabled them not just to command the information that they knew, but also to speak credibly on issues that they might not be as well researched on, using the vernacular and the language of the people whose articles they've read over the course of the debate season. Another competitive benefit of research is that it helps you get better at topic research over time. This is because, for much of the same reason why I talked about research helping make you sound smarter, government and academia kind of have a language for communicating about issues that is very specialized and distinct from the way that we communicate day to day. Specifically on criminal justice, there's a legal jargon that lawyers use to talk about this issue. There's an activist jargon where activists develop catchphrases or shorthands or slogans that enable them to capture complex ideas and distill them, enabling them to communicate more efficiently. There's also political aspects, where politicians discuss options like defunding the police, or politicians discuss laws that they would consider reforming. All of those are not languages that you can pick up automatically. They're only languages that you can pick up by becoming engrossed in the literature, especially in the field of criminal justice reform, which is a very legal-heavy topic, so you're not just going to be able to get into it without doing some research on your own. The final main competitive benefit is about being on the cutting edge. I really like to partake casually in card games, like trading card games, and a common idea that I come across when I dip my toes in is this notion of a metagame. So, a metagame is the idea that every game that you play occurs within a broader environment of what other games and playstyles are popular. And part of being good at each individual game is being good at reading and responding to the metagame. So this might make a little bit more sense when I apply it to debate. So in debate, this is probably a much more familiar concept, which is that arguments don't exist in a vacuum, and whether they are good or bad is determined by the way that they relate to other arguments that a lot of people are making in the debate community throughout tournaments. So, for example, you might think that a statement like, "the state's counterplan is really good on this topic," is probably a safe statement to make, just because during the topic lecture, we talked a lot about how a lot of policing activity occurs at the state level, most prisons are state-run, and most law enforcement activity occurs in state and local jurisdictions. But the state's counterplan is good is a conditional statement, because there are some arguments that it's better against than other arguments, and if the metagame is saturated with the state's counterplan, a rational, responsive, strategic affirmative team is going to choose to pivot to an affirmative that is much less vulnerable to that approach. So, for example, if a lot of people anticipate the state's counterplan, then they might read a lot of AFs with federal jurisdictions, and the state's counterplan might not turn out to be very good on the topic, even though, ideally, in what would seem to be the core of criminal justice reform debates, the state's counterplan is a very credible option. The key to exploiting changes like this is research, because whenever you have a metagame that evolves over the course of the season, with teams reacting strategically to each other, it's never going to be static. And no matter what we do at camp, we're never going to be able to anticipate every single variant of why a metagame might change and what directions it might go in. So being good at research is key to keeping up with all of that. And you can do this either through new twists on existing arguments or new arguments entirely. That doesn't matter. The point is that you need to be able to evolve your argumentation in such a way that responds to the way that the community overall is evolving theirs. So with that, let's talk about evidence. So, what do we mean by good evidence? What should evidence do? And what is a good card? So, the basics. What is evidence? Evidence is a claim with data or support that we use to make an argument in debate. An important concept is that evidence does not make arguments. It supports arguments that you yourself are making. The reason that matters is because frequently debaters fall into the trap of saying we read cards on that issue and assuming that that stands in for an argument, when that isn't the case. Reading cards on an issue provides backup for your argument, but it still falls to you to advance the argument yourself. Evidence can play a variety of different roles, per the competitive benefits of research that I described above. What makes good evidence? So, a top-level concept, before I get into specific traits of good evidence, is that good evidence is evidence that helps you win. That should seem like it's obvious, but the reason that I say that at the top is that there's no one set of traits that defines what a good card is across every single conceivable circumstance. there's going to be different contexts, there's going to be different applications, and there's going to be different trade-offs that might make you value some traits of evidence more than other traits in a particular scenario. Generally, we look for a couple of traits in a good card, and that's the idea of a card being qualified, or a card fleshing out its arguments, a card making comparisons between its argument and the opposition's argument, and a card being conclusive, such as a card not being ambiguous and clearly coming down on one side of an issue. But depending on the situation, some of those attributes might be way more important than others of those attributes. There might be scenarios where you might want to sacrifice a little bit of qualifications on a card because you might want to read a card with more rhetorical flair. So now that we've talked a little bit about what makes a good piece of evidence, let's talk about broad principles of research and how you should go about assembling the idea of a good piece of evidence into a finished research project in a completed file. So the first principle that I want to start off by talking about is the idea that work and research are patience and perseverance. Working hard is not a matter of just putting in effort. Working hard is a matter of retaining focus over a long period of time. It's about internalizing lessons, and it's about realizing that research is inherently a very slow and tedious process. Nothing about research is easy, and if it was, we wouldn't care about debate as the game that it is. Debate and research are frustrating at times, and it is natural that no matter how good or how experienced you are at research, whenever you approach a new idea, you're never going to be guaranteed to be successful at cracking the code on your first attempt. No one is born a great researcher either. It is a long process of improvement that never ends, and the earlier that you start getting better at research, the better you're going to end up. Too many debaters figure this out too late and kind of coast on the research element and only start kicking up the pace on learning how to become a good researcher late in their career by the time that it's too late. A way to think about this that just kind of puts it into perspective is to think about cards in terms of numbers. So if you think about yourself at the end of a season, if you imagine yourself having completed the season and you know that you have cut 1,000 cards over the course of the season, that sounds like a lot, right? Well, between the day that you arrived on campus and the last day of the TOC is just over 300 days. And for those of you that are bad at math, if you do that division, that ends up being about 3 cards a day to get to 1,000 in a season. So if you think about it in those terms, getting to 1,000 cards over the course of a season is actually not that hard. I think a reasonable upper bound for a high schooler is to cut 10 cards in a day. And if you spend 100 minutes a day, that's 10 minutes per card, and over 3,000 cards in a season. So getting to large volumes is not actually that difficult if you space out your efforts and view it as a long project of improvement rather than a sprint at the very end when you're kind of cramming. Learning how to research is not something that can be crammed. It's something that you have to develop over a long period of time. The second broad suggestion for how you should think about research is that you should start broad and then narrow. This is a principle that applies both at the macro scale at the level of a topic and also at the micro scale whenever you're trying to research any particular claim. The first phase is figuring out what you want to actually say. So you might be assigned something externally, but the precise variant might be uncertain, or you might have entirely autonomy to figure out what argument you want to be writing. So that first stage relies on you reading a lot of stuff in the literature base, exploring, constructing a mental map of how concepts in the literature base interact, and forming a kind of representative sample of opinions. So, should criminal justice reform be enacted in way X? Should it be enacted in way Y or way Z? And so all of those kind of form a mental construction of how you understand the topic and various elements of it to interact with one another. Once you've chosen, by figuring out what the right portion of the literature base is, or which portion of the literature base you've chosen to defend, the next stage is fleshing out your argument. This is the stage where you attempt to exhaust the literature base using broad Google searches and downloading all Lexis results and things like that. And typically, if you're cutting a very mainstream position where the contours of it are kind of fleshed out in the literature and you're not fabricating a position based off of marginal positions and mashing them together in a way that scholars in the lit didn't anticipate, if you just do broad searches and exhaust the literature base, you're eventually going to get to about 60 to 70% of a completed file. It'll get you to most of the core debates about the particular subset of the CJR topic that you've picked, and it'll enable you to figure out how those debates play out. The final phase is filling holes. So now that you've exhausted the literature base and you've fleshed out most of your file, you're going to have a couple of gaps left over. So if you're writing a counterplan, for example, you're not going to end up organically with a prom to the counterplan block. You're going to have to cut some extra definitions. You're going to have to go out of your way. If you're writing a disad, you're not organically going to come up with a disad turns the case wall, or a link turns the case wall, or an impact outweighs argument. You have to go out and look for all of those things specifically. So that's what I mean by filling holes. And that's once you have the skeleton of your argument, you have to plug in the gaps and close the gap between what the best argument in the literature is and what the best argument for debate is. So the third thing that you need to do, and this is kind of something that I already mentioned, is that you should hope to exhaust the literature base whenever you attempt a research project. And you're never going to be able to do this for real. The literature base is incredibly sweeping, especially on such a deep topic like criminal justice reform. It's unworkable to expect yourself to be able to read everything that's out there. But your assumption should be that given infinite time, you would end up reading everything that was written on your subject. And that means that completing a file means looking through all the databases available to you, chasing down all of the relevant looking footnotes, etc. It's important to keep files with cites that you haven't run down yet, in the same way that it's important to write a notes section. All of those to-do features help you identify directions in which the file can grow. And that underscores another reality, which is that if you're approaching a research project with the intention of exhausting the literature base, a thing that is always going to be in your mind is that the file is never fundamentally done. There's always room for improvement, and there's always a next step. And so even if you turn out a file, having a document where you've logged the directions that you've come across that you didn't choose to pursue, or the citations that you didn't look up, or the potential argument ideas that you came up with but never really had time to implement, all of those things should be logged whenever you turn out a file, with the goal of exhausting the literature base. The fourth suggestion that I have is that you should always research both sides. This one is pretty simple and intuitive, but a lot of people forget to do it or are too lazy to do it. I frequently fall victim to that just because it's not an organic thing to do. You want to complete your argument, and your argument is the one side that you're pursuing. But the fundamental reality is that you're never going to complete an argument until you know all of the responses to it. You have no idea if you finished an AF until you've written the best version of the neg, and then answered that best version of the neg. And then the neg would answer the best version of your answers, and then you would answer the best version of their answers. That's kind of what makes debate an infinitely deep rabbit hole, where there's inevitable, iterative strategic evolution, where people innovate responses to each other's stuff, and all of that happens over the course of a debate season. But your files aren't really complete until you've done that yourself, to a certain degree. Which is why, even if you can't do it to the nth degree, even if you can't go to the nth level of the rabbit hole and figure out how deep it goes, you should still do a couple of iterations and figure out what the most likely neg responses are. The next suggestion I have is one I also already mentioned a little bit, which is that you should look through citations and footnotes. I'm going to talk a little bit more detailed about this in a little bit, but the general idea of this is that you obviously want to figure out how ideas in the literature relate to each other. And conveniently, bibliographies are kind of a tool that does that for you. Whenever an author writes an article, they write a list of references at the bottom of it, where everything that is relevant to that article's argument is logged, and you have a comprehensive list of everything that that author believed to be important. Since these are people who have careers in research professions, they're frequently going to be better than you are at assembling the most relevant pieces of the literature. So you should use bibliographies as your resource, and whenever you have a good article, you should always check out what are the articles that article cites, because that will typically bring you more useful citations. My next suggestion is that you should have a system for managing lucky encounters. And what I mean by this is you are inevitably going to come across stuff that is not directly related to your file. You're going to come across a politics link to your AF, for example, when you're cutting an AF. Or you might come across a counterplan idea. Or if you're cutting a case neg, you might come across an AF idea that hadn't ever occurred to you. Having a system for managing those encounters means that you can log and remember those interactions, and when you need new ideas in the future, you can refer to that log as a source of inspiration. Many files that a lot of people spend a lot of dedicated hours working on shouldn't even really be assignments. For example, politics links is a file that a lot of high schools work on, but really politics links shouldn't be an assignment. It should be a thing that just comes together naturally as a result of everybody coming across a bunch of articles that say that the plan is unpopular. Doing dedicated searches about politics links is maybe something that could fill up 10% of the file, but by no means should it be the bulk of your work. And having a system to manage lucky encounters does all of that for you. It enables you to track all of that information and eliminate those inefficiencies from your work. My next suggestion is that you should use your resources creatively. Here at camp, this means relying on us, your lab leaders, who have a pool of expertise that is difficult to match in any program. And by expertise, I don't just mean knowledge about debate, but just like exposure to debate as an activity over the course of many, many years of our lives. And we've encountered many different things. We've learned many different lessons. We've failed many times. And it's better for you to learn from our failures and learn from our experiences than to have to accumulate your own. So you should use the unique opportunity that camp presents you to ask us a bunch of questions. Here at camp, it also means relying on the incredible university resources that you have access to. Back at home, it could be way more open than that. Even if you don't have coaching, although if you do have coaching, you should, of course, rely on the expertise of your coaches. But even if you don't have coaching, you can rely on other people. You could rely on your teammates. You could rely on your classmates who aren't even debaters. You can rely on teachers at your school, librarians at your school, even your parents. When I wrote my most complicated AFs, one of my tactics to determine if my explanation of concepts in the 1AC is clear enough is always to run it by someone who isn't a debater, because I know that if the 1AC can communicate a concept to a non-debater, someone who's steeped in the jargon that I'm using is going to have a much better time understanding it, and I've likely done enough to communicate what the 1AC is about. School librarians are an enormously helpful resource. Many of these databases are accessible indirectly through your school library through services like interlibrary loan, even if you don't subscribe to them directly. So use your resources to gain access to materials. The final suggestion that I have is that you should establish goals and priorities. You will not be able to write the perfect AF against every team. You will not be able to write the perfect neg against every AF that is in the field. So inherently, whenever you're doing a research project, research is inevitably going to involve some triage or some judicious allocation of resources based on the fact that you just don't have infinite time to do debate work. So how you do that is going to be determined by your priorities. Is your priority to win a national tournament? Then your triage calculation cannot involve doing comprehensive neg work against every single team that is at the bottom half of the pool. It just isn't going to happen. You don't have time to answer all those people. To a certain degree, you have to just take on a little bit of risk and assume that you're going to be able to beat them without having a specific strategy. But if your strategy involves breaking, then you have an entirely different set of teams that you need to target. You have to target the teams on the bubble. If your goal is to get bids, then you want to identify the teams that are the most likely to encounter you in your bid round. You need to have some idea of where in the bracket you're going to break, where those teams typically break, and that will determine which affirmatives you should write negs to. So all of those calculations and all of those assessments about how good you are, what your realistic goals are, and what research you can realistically accomplish, all of that should determine how you allocate your finite resources in pursuit of research goals. So with that, let's talk a little bit about how to specifically implement these into an effective search strategy. The first thing I want to talk about is Google. There's a couple of key things that you need to know about how Google works as a search engine. The first is quotation marks. Quotation marks make it so the exact phrase that you search for is the phrase that comes up whenever you search. So for example, if I search nuclear war in quotation marks, you can see that only articles that have the complete phrase nuclear war have appeared. If I search nuclear war, nuclear winter, then only articles with both of those phrases appears. So this is useful if you want to screen out extraneous information. So if there's a phrase that contains a component that comes across in other contexts, but the entire phrase is something that reflects the concept you're precisely looking for, you want to use quotations so that you can force Google to only look at the phrase that you want it to look at. Another handy tool is the not modifier or the minus modifier. So if you use minus or a hyphen, then we're only going to get articles about nuclear war that do not use the phrase nuclear winter. So as you can see, we have a bunch of articles here about nuclear war. We don't have any articles that mention the phrase nuclear winter. Another useful term is and. And means that both search terms that you've searched are going to be included in your search results. So for example, if I want to search nuclear and war, I have a bunch of articles that use the words nuclear and the word war, but you'll notice that since I took out the quotation marks, not all of the articles have these words next to each other. So here, I know that all of these articles are going to include both of the terms, but since it's not a phrase, then it's not going to restrict it to those articles where those words are together. Another useful term is around. So this one is helpful for if you're getting articles that bring up all of the concepts that you're searching for, but in unrelated environments. So for example, if you're getting a lot of book search results, and maybe in one chapter at the very beginning it mentions one of your search terms, and then 5 chapters later it mentions another one, that's not what you're looking for because those concepts aren't linked with each other. The way that you can moderate that is through the around modifier, which looks like this. You type in nuclear around, and then you use parentheses, and then you type a number in the parentheses. So what this means is that it will still use both nuclear and war, but not only that, it will also limit it to only those articles where nuclear and war are within 5 words of each other. So that's a super helpful way that you can limit out miscellaneous articles. So the last thing that I'll show you about Google is how to limit searches to the appropriate dates. So to do that, all you have to do is click on Tools, then click on Anytime, then click Custom Range, and then click on the date that you want to filter it to. So for example, from 2015. Searches between January 1st, 2015 and today. That limits out a bunch of the older articles about nuclear war that I had received in the past. The last thing that I'll mention about Google is that there's obviously other types of Google that you should also use. So Google News is really good at filtering out only those sources that are typically considered to be newspapers. And so if you're looking for a newspaper style article, Google News is a great service that you can use. Another Google service that I use a lot where all of these same modifiers work is Google Scholar. Google Scholar is a great service that basically just searches for academic articles. One of the neat things about it is when a PDF of the file is publicly accessible, it'll display it right there in the Google Scholar results. So for example, if I'm looking for this Ehrlich 83 article about the consequences of nuclear war, all I have to do is click on this PDF link, and there we are. The PDF is right there. So Google Scholar makes it really easy to access the full text of articles that are publicly available. Next, I want to talk to you about databases. With databases, there are a couple of critical elements to remember across the board before I go into any specific databases. First is that a lot of databases have similar functionality, but it's hidden behind a different coding system or a different exact command that you have to type in. So if you've arrived at a database that you are not familiar with, it is likely that there's going to be a function for searching for the phrase, for excluding words, for using or chains. So that's when you want to use one phrase or another phrase in your search results, or that function where you can look for words or phrases that are within X number of words of each other. All of that functionality is highly likely to be in the vast majority of databases that you use. So if you can't figure out how to do it, you should not hesitate to just Google it for the particular database that you're looking at. And there's likely going to be a manual of some kind that explains exactly how that works in that particular database. There are a couple of functions that also appear in a lot of databases that you should look out for whenever you're researching with a database. The first such function is called a radical. So a radical, and similar to that is various forms of truncations or wildcards. The idea here is basically if you want to use the same stem of a search term, but you want to include variations on that search term. So for example, if you're looking for definition cards, you might type in DEFIN and then a radical. And in some databases, what that will do is it will tell the database to look for all words that start with defin and then return those results. So it will return definition, define, defined. So all of those are obviously helpful, and we want to include all those in our search results, so the radical is very helpful. At some other times, you might want to specify how many letters you would want to be included in the variation. So you maybe want define, but you don't want definition. So in that case, you would use a different kind of radical, which is called a wildcard. And that one basically is a symbol that stands in for a particular letter, and only that letter spot is going to vary. So if you put radical or if you put wildcard and then affined, that'll include defined, refined, etc. Common truncation or radical symbols or wildcard symbols include the asterisk, the exclamation point, the question mark, or the hashtag. And you're going to have to look at each individual database to figure out what's going on in that particular case. Another common function that is available in a lot of databases is prioritizing certain search terms over other search terms. So when might this be relevant? So you might have a situation where, for example, you're searching for China and IPR, and what you're looking for is a bunch of articles about the trade war. So China and IPR might include a lot of results that are relevant, but a lot of results that are irrelevant. For example, it might return a bunch of law articles that are talking about China, and they're mostly talking about the legitimacy of particular IPR laws, but they mention China in passing. Or you could get articles that are primarily talking about China and the US-China relationship as a whole, and they mention IPR in passing. So one of those might be good for you, one of those might be bad for you, and in many databases, you can tell the database which search term you care about more, and that will enable you to choose between those branches of search results. So another function that is available in all databases is searching in segments or fields. And this is very basic. So if you want to search in the title, you would search terms that would appear in the title. If you want to search for an author, you might want to specify that you're searching in the author field. That's something that can be helpful across a variety of databases. And then the last thing to be aware of within databases is that nearly always databases will let you search within search results. And what that enables you to do is, if you mess something up, if you phrase your search terms way too broadly, you don't have to burn it down and start over. You can search within those search results to narrow your stuff a little bit more effectively. To wrap this up, I want to talk to you a little bit about specifically using Lexis as an example of some of those tools that I was talking about earlier. So the first thing that's important to know about Lexis is that it's a dinosaur. So like I was mentioning earlier, a lot of Lexis's functionality is super helpful, but not exactly the most intuitive. So a lot of what I figured out about Lexis, I figured out by literally reading the Lexis manual or getting it told to me by other people. But you shouldn't wait for everybody to explain to you exactly how to use every single database. You can be proactive. You can look up all of that stuff if you come across a database that you don't know how to use. So what is Lexis good for? Lexis is good for a couple of critical things. First is law reviews, which is just like legal commentary from legal professionals, either lawyers or law professors or law students. They write articles, notes, which are basically commentary on either broad fields of law or currently evolving legal issues. And another thing that Lexis is good for is court cases, which I typically find are very useful for topicality cards and definitions, since courts very frequently have to decide definitional questions. And the last thing that I use Lexis very frequently for is for legal briefs, which is when there's a dispute before a court. Parties often will file these briefs which lay out their arguments for why their side is correct. And basically what they are is, whenever you have a legal issue, you literally have these paid debaters who write up the most persuasive version of the essay to send it to a judge. And so phenomenal cards have come out of legal briefs for me, although you have to very narrowly choose why you would delve into legal briefs, since only legal issues are really discussed in those contexts. But on the criminal justice reform topic, very many of those issues are going to be legal, and so frequently legal briefs are going to be a valuable source. Lexis has much of the same functionality that Google has and that other databases have, but it has a bit of a unique representation or coding that you have to type into the search bar to make it do what you want. So one thing that Lexis has is W/P, which is something you put between search terms if you want it to look within the same paragraph. W/S is the same thing, but for the same sentence. W/a number is like Google's around command, so it'll look for search terms that are within X number of words of each other. Lexis has a version of the hyphen, or the not command, which is and not. Lexis also has this nifty command called at least, which is super helpful at that prioritization thing that I was describing a little bit earlier. And the way that you enter this is actually somewhat counterintuitive. So let's say that I'm looking for an article that talks a lot about baseball bats and mentions them offhand as a weapon. If I type in weapon and baseball bat, I'm probably not going to get very specifically tailored results to what I'm looking for. I'm probably going to get a lot of articles about weapons in general, maybe some that mention baseball bats offhand, but I want baseball bats to be more important. So one way that I could do this is I could type in at least 2 and then weapon and at least 10 baseball bat. And if I search that within cases, you can see that all of these articles, in this case the orange designator is the one that refers to baseball bats, and you can see that I'm getting quite a few articles where there's a lot of orange and not so much green, and that's because I've instructed Lexis to prioritize baseball bats over weapons. And that makes it so weapon is mentioned at least twice in the article, whereas baseball bat is mentioned at least 10 times. Another function that is super useful in Lexis is finding similar articles to things that you have searched in the past. And I really had to dig in the Lexis settings to find this one because it's really not intuitive at all. So you have to do some searches to bring up some articles that you're interested in. So let me do a search in secondary materials, which is how you get to law reviews. So we have our baseball bat weapon search. So I'm going to click around over here. And in my secondary materials, I'm actually going to open these articles, because opening the articles is necessary for it to get reflected in what I'm going to show you in a second. All right. Now that we've opened some of these articles, we've built up a little bit of a search record. So what we want to do next is we want to go up here to history. And once we're in that, you should be shown a menu. And after that menu, you want to click on Research Map. So as you can see, we have a little bit of a map of our searches that display our search activity. And so you see this little gray thing? That gray thing reflects articles that I clicked on and opened. So you have to click on that gray button and it will expand and give you some options. And then if you click one of these options, you can hit select this document to find similar. And you'll notice that this find similar documents button appears at the top with a little number 1 next to it. So that means that you've started your count for the number of similar articles that you're allowed to find. You're allowed to pick up to 3. So let's say I want to pick this one too. So I'll click find similar documents in that one as well. And then when I click this button and hit find similar documents, Lexis will look at all of the articles that I've selected and try to find me articles that are similar to that one. So in this case, nothing matched my citation patterns, so I'm out of luck. There are no similar documents to this particular pattern of law reviews about baseballs, bats, and weapons, but that's the general series of steps that you have to follow. That's all I'm going to say about Lexis for now. Other databases that I would keep on your radar are Project Muse, which is a really good database for cutting K-cards, especially I've found. JSTOR is a good one. Academic Search Complete is a good one. EBSCOhost is a great one. And then for law reviews specifically, you want to be using Lexis, which is the one I just showed you. And there's another one called Hein Online, which is great. Interlibrary Loan is also your friend in this respect. So if you cannot figure out how to get an article from Georgetown through their library, it might be because they don't have access to it or they don't have a subscription to that journal. And in that case, there's an interlibrary loan page that you can go to request that article instead. That wraps up everything I wanted to say about basic research. If you have any questions about any of what I've talked about, you should make sure to write those questions down and ask them as soon as lab starts. Remember that so far we've been using the public chat to a great degree, but the chat actually has a private function. So if you're worried about asking questions about something, or you don't want people to know, or you want to ask anonymously or something, this format actually enables you to ask lab leaders privately in the Zoom chat. So if you're worried about people knowing something about your research habits or something, don't worry about it. You can just use the private Zoom channel, and then we'll answer the question and nobody will know who asked. So don't worry about reaching out to us. We're here to help, and we're going to go over research in a lot more detail tomorrow. See you then.